Have you ever just stopped and wondered how your computer is doing all of that? Streaming music, juggling 20 browser tabs, and popping up notifications all at the same time without completely melting down? Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the magic that makes it all possible. We're talking about processes and threads.
Seriously, think about it. It feels impossible, right? But underneath that smooth, seamless experience, your computer is basically a master juggler, keeping a dozen different tasks in the air every single second. So, what's the secret? How does it actually manage all of that chaos? Well, the answer comes down to how your operating system, your OS, delegates all the work. It has two main types of workers it can call on to get things done: processes and threads. You can think of these as the absolute bedrock of multitasking, the very things that turn your computer from a silent box into a responsive powerhouse. All right, so let's meet our first worker, the process. I kind of like to think of a process as the independent specialist on the team. The one who shows up with their own complete set of tools, works in their own dedicated space, and doesn't really need to bother anyone else. So, what is a process, really? At its core, it's just a program in action. See, when your web browser is just an icon sitting on your desktop, it's just a file, a lifeless set of instructions. But the very moment you double-click it, your OS breathes life into that code. And voila, you have a process. Oh, this is a great way to think about it. A program is like a car sitting in the driveway. It has all this potential, right? But it's not actually doing anything. A process, on the other hand, is the actual trip. It's the engine running, the wheels turning, the journey from point A to point B. The process is what makes that program useful. And every single process is like its own little self-contained universe. It gets its very own private chunk of memory, a unique ID so the OS can keep track of it, and a list of all the resources it needs, like files or network connections. This all-in-one, fully loaded package is exactly why we call processes heavyweight. They carry everything they need with them. Now, being so self-contained leads to a pretty major trade-off. The huge upside? Safety. Because processes are totally isolated, if your music app crashes, it's not going to bring your web browser down with it. Phew. But the downside? All that isolation makes it really hard for them to talk to each other. Communication becomes slow and complicated because they need the OS to act like a mail carrier between. So, if processes are the independent specialists, what happens when you need a team that can work together closely? Well, for those jobs, the OS brings in its second type of worker, the thread. A thread is the actual flow of instructions that's doing the work. So while the process is the container holding all the resources, the threads are the actual workers inside that container. For example, in a word processor, you might have one thread that's listening for your keystrokes and another that's running the spell checker in the background. They're both part of the same process, just working on different tasks. Here's a fantastic analogy to make it stick. Using multiple processes is like hiring a completely separate construction crew for every single house you want to build. Each crew has its own truck, its own tools, its own lunch coolers, everything. But using multiple threads, that's like having one big, efficient crew that shares a single set of power tools to work on several houses all at once. Way more efficient, right? And that's exactly why we call threads lightweight. They don't have all that baggage. They don't need their own separate memory or a huge list of resources. They just share everything that belongs to their parent process. This makes them way faster to create and a lot easier for the OS to manage. Okay, so we've met our two workers, the independent heavyweight process and the collaborative lightweight thread. So how do you decide which one to hire for the job? Well, let's put them head to head. This table really breaks it down. Creating a process? Slow. Creating a thread? Super fast. Memory? Processes keep it all to themselves, while threads share it openly. This means communication between processes is slow, but between threads, it's practically instant. But, and this is the big one, the crash impact. If a process crashes, it's contained, it's safe. But if a single thread crashes, it can take down the entire application with it. So it really boils down to that classic trade-off. Do you want safety or do you want speed? So with all of that in mind, how do you actually make the call? When you're designing a piece of software, how do you know which building block is the right one to use? It pretty much comes down to asking yourself these three questions. First, do you need isolation? If the answer is a hard yes, like in a web browser, where you definitely don't want one bad tab to crash everything, then you go with processes. Second, do you need speed? If your tasks need to share a ton of data and talk to each other constantly, threads are the no-brainer choice. But number three, you have to be ready to manage the risk that comes with that speed. When you use Threads, it's on you to make sure they play nice and don't trip over each other and corrupt the data they're sharing. Look, all this can sound really complex and maybe a little intimidating, and that's why I absolutely love this quote from the source material. It just completely reframes the whole challenge. Instead of seeing a tangled mess, it's asking you to see a playground, a world of possibilities. And that's exactly what these concepts are. They're just powerful tools in your programming toolkit. You've got processes for safety, and you've got threads for speed. This is your basket of yarn. You have all the pieces you need to go out there and build something incredible.
So I'll just leave you with this final question, because it really gets to the heart of everything we've talked about. The next time you sit down to start a project, ask yourself, what kind of team does this job need? Do I need a group of independent, self-sufficient specialists, or do I need one highly collaborative, fast-moving crew? Because choosing between a process and a thread, well, it's all about picking the right team for the job.